imagine the profound psychological impact on Lucas in this hypothetical scenario. He breaches the fortress, his adrenaline pumping through his veins, fully prepared to face armed guards or complex security systems, only to find the lifeless body of the man who has been deceiving the entire town for months. This implies that the rescue mission instantly devolves into a chaotic, terrifying nightmare. Lucas, acting on pure survival instinct, would have to secure the immediate area, all while grappling with the unforeseen fallout of finding Cassius dead on the cold stone floor. The sheer shock of this gruesome discovery would ripple through his mind, forcing him to question absolutely everything he thought he knew about the people trapped inside those thick stone walls. When we break down the potential suspects who could have committed this hypothetical crime, the very first person who comes to mind is Jocelyn. If you ask me, the sheer psychological trauma of being held against her will by a master manipulator like Cassius would push anyone, no matter how strong, to their absolute breaking point. It looks like her primal survival instincts would eventually override any sense of moral restraint or hesitation. If Cassius cornered her in a dark hallway, or if she saw a fleeting, desperate window of opportunity to escape her stone prison, could it be that a violent physical struggle ensued? In a terrifying life-or-death confrontation, a calculated move to disarm or incapacitate her captor could easily and tragically result in a fatal accident. This would leave Jocelyn as the prime suspect, bearing the incredibly heavy burden of being the last person to see him alive. Furthermore, we absolutely have to analyze the profound emotional toll this extended captivity has taken on Jocelyn. She is not someone who just sits back passively and waits for a knight in shining armor to rescue her. She is fiercely independent, highly intelligent, and incredibly resourceful. This implies that she has been quietly observing Cassius, memorizing his daily routines, tracking his movements, and waiting for the perfect, singular moment to strike back. If she realized that Ross was closing in and that her chances of survival were dropping by the terrifying second, she might have made a preemptive, highly calculated move to secure her own freedom. However, I highly doubt she intended to commit premeditated, cold-blooded murder. It looks like it would be a tragic, horrifying case of self-defense, an unforeseen fallout from a desperate bid for freedom that ended in the ultimate, irreversible tragedy. But we absolutely cannot ignore the sinister, looming presence of Ross in this deadly equation. If you ask me, Ross operates entirely on cold logic, brutal self-preservation, and a ruthless desire to maintain absolute control over his illicit empire. Could it be that Cassius, perhaps experiencing a rare, fleeting moment of conscience, or simply realizing that Ross was going to eliminate him anyway to tie up loose ends, decided to completely flip the script? If Cassius suddenly attempted to help Jocelyn and Liesel escape the island, intending to expose Ross and his entire global operation to the authorities, Ross would have an immediate, overwhelming psychological motive to silence him permanently. Eliminating a rogue asset is a classic, calculated move for a dangerous man in his precarious position. This implies that Ross might have caught wind of a potential betrayal brewing in the shadows of the castle. He is deeply paranoid, highly observant, and possesses a vast network of informants, meaning he would not hesitate for a single second to eliminate a walking liability. If you ask me, Ross views Cassius not as an equal partner, but as an entirely disposable pawn on a much larger chessboard. The very moment that pawn threatens the king, it is ruthlessly removed from the board without a second thought. A fatal confrontation between Ross and Cassius would be chillingly cold, shockingly swift, and devastatingly brutal. Ross would not leave anything to chance, ensuring that the only person who could unravel his dark, closely guarded secrets is silenced forever, leaving Lucas and Carly to stumble upon the gruesome, bloody aftermath of his handiwork. Then there is the absolute wild card in this deadly scenario, Jens. We know for a fact that Jens is currently orchestrating a massive, chaotic web of revenge across the city, and his capacity for unhinged violence is virtually limitless. It looks like Jens might harbor a deep-seated, obsessive belief that Cassius knew the absolute truth about who really murdered Marco all along. If Jens concluded that Cassius was intentionally protecting the real killer or hiding vital intelligence to serve his own dark, ulterior motive, the completely shattered trust between them would instantly turn lethal. Could it be that Jens secretly infiltrated the island fortress specifically to extract this crucial information, only to execute Cassius in cold blood when he stubbornly refused to cooperate? If you ask me, Jens does not operate with even a single ounce of mercy or hesitation. His entire psychological motive is driven by a burning, unquenchable need for violent retribution. This implies that if he managed to cross paths with Cassius in those dark corridors, the interrogation would escalate rapidly into a deadly physical altercation. Jens might have viewed Cassius's continued silence as a direct, unforgivable insult to Marco's memory, a profound betrayal that could only be paid for with a river of blood. A calculated move by Jens to permanently eliminate Cassius would not only serve his personal twisted vendetta, but also send a horrifying, unmistakable message to anyone else who dares to cross him, adding a truly terrifying layer of complexity to the unfolding murder mystery. Finally, we must deeply and carefully analyze the most heartbreaking suspect of all in this hypothetical tragedy, Liesel. As a fiercely protective mother, her psychological motive is incredibly complex, deeply layered, and profoundly tragic. She has been forced to watch her own son slowly descend into a dark abyss of deception, emotional manipulation, and pure, unadulterated evil. It looks like she might finally reach a devastating, irreversible breaking point where she realizes, with absolute horror, that Cassius is completely beyond redemption. Could it be that Liesel, in a moment of unimaginable sorrow and desperate, blinding clarity, decides that the only possible way to stop the endless cycle of violence and protect innocent lives like Jocelyn's is to end her own son's life? This implies a level of emotional devastation that is almost too painful to fathom. If you ask me, Liesel taking the life of her own flesh and blood would be the ultimate, horrific sacrifice a mother could ever make. It would not be an act of malice or hatred, but rather a calculated move born out of a deeply twisted sense of mercy and profound, agonizing maternal grief. She might view it as her absolute tragic duty to stop the terrifying monster she brought into the world before he destroys anyone else. The unforeseen fallout of such a drastic action would completely shatter her soul into a million pieces, leaving her an empty, hollow shell of a woman, clutching the devastating, bloody secret of what she had to do in the dark, silent corners of that castle. So, let us divide these gripping possibilities into two distinct branching paths for our analysis. In scenario A, it looks like the hypothetical murder is the direct, chaotic result of a desperate escape attempt gone horribly wrong. This implies that either Jocelyn or Liesel is the unintentional culprit. If we follow this specific thread, the narrative focuses heavily on the primal instinct for survival and the incredibly tragic consequences of long-term captivity. Could it be that Jocelyn pushed Cassius during a frantic, adrenaline-fueled struggle, causing a fatal head injury against the stone walls? Or perhaps Liesel intervened at the last possible second, striking her son down with a heavy object to save the young woman he was cruelly tormenting? This scenario paints the death as an accidental or strictly defensive tragedy, heavily laden with severe emotional trauma and the desperate, burning need for freedom. If scenario A ultimately plays out on our screens, the psychological fallout for the survivor would be absolutely immense and life-altering. If you ask me, Jocelyn would be deeply haunted by the taking of a human life, even if the act was entirely justified by self-defense. It looks like she would struggle immensely to process the sheer violence of her own actions, creating a massive, debilitating internal conflict that could take months, if not years, to unravel. If Liesel is the one who ultimately pulled the trigger or delivered the fatal blow, her completely shattered trust in herself and her profound, suffocating grief would likely drive her to completely confess to the authorities. Or, perhaps, she would try to cover up the crime scene to protect Jocelyn, weaving an entirely new, dangerous web of lies to hide her ultimate, heartbreaking sacrifice from the rest of the world. On the other hand, we have scenario B, where the hardened villains turn their weapons on each other in a ruthless bid for supremacy. It looks like Ross or Jens are the primary actors in this incredibly violent, calculated path. This implies a much more cold-blooded, meticulously planned execution. Could it be that Ross silently poisoned Cassius's drink to avoid a messy confrontation, or that Jens ambushed him with a silenced weapon in the dark shadows of the sprawling estate? If you ask me, this scenario dramatically shifts the narrative focus from an emotional, character-driven tragedy to a ruthless, high-stakes power struggle. The psychological motive here is purely about asserting dominance, permanently silencing liabilities, and ensuring that dark, profitable secrets remain buried forever beneath the cold stone floors of the island. If scenario B is indeed the grim reality, Lucas and Carly are walking blindly into a highly sophisticated, meticulously sanitized crime scene. It looks like Ross or Jens would not leave any obvious, careless clues behind, meaning the subsequent police investigation would require peeling back countless layers of a massive criminal conspiracy. This implies that the local authorities would be endlessly chasing ghosts, while the true, cold-blooded killer continues to operate freely in the shadows, completely unbothered by the sheer chaos and devastation they left behind. A calculated move by a seasoned professional villain like Ross or Jens would almost certainly ensure that someone else, perhaps even an innocent bystander like Jocelyn or a grieving mother like Liesel, takes the ultimate fall for the murder, adding an infuriating, deeply unfair layer of injustice to the central mystery. Ultimately, this incredibly dangerous deadlock leaves us with a chilling, expansive array of narrative possibilities. If you ask me, the writers are brilliantly setting up a complex scenario where the absolute truth is heavily obscured by multiple, overlapping layers of deceit, shattered trust, and deeply hidden ulterior motives. Could it be that the person we currently least suspect is actually the one standing there with Cassius's blood on their hands? It looks like we are in for a very long, highly agonizing wait to uncover the real, unvarnished story behind this hypothetical crime scene. One thing is absolutely certain. If Cassius truly meets his violent end on that isolated island, the unforeseen fallout will forever alter the lives of every single person involved, and the subsequent search for justice will be anything but simple or straightforward. We will just have to keep our eyes glued to the screen, analyzing every subtle glance and hidden clue to see exactly how this incredibly dark, twisted puzzle pieces itself together.